Hi and welcome to Pick a Book. And the book I'm going to be talking about today is called Orienting, an Indian in Japan. This is written by an author called Pallavi Aiyar. Now I know Pallavi Aiyar. We used to be colleagues when in NDTV I was a producer about 20 years ago. And she was a reporter / journalist. And she went on to be a journalist after that in Europe. She wrote for a bunch of periodicals and newspapers, both Indian and international, in Europe, in China, in Indonesia, and then finally in Japan. And so her books, she's written a few of them. Those books are all about her experiences moving different countries, but along with countries, changing cultures, learning new languages, her personal experiences combined with the experience of being a journalist in these places, hunting down stories, researching stories. So it makes her books really interesting. Punjabi Parmesan was one of the books that I've read, which was based on her time in Europe, covering Europe for some publications. And the stories that she came up with there were very interesting, and they kind of still help me understand what went on, the cultural trends, the economic trends in Europe, and how winds were changing, what was happening. Because we tend to have an understanding of all these countries through very formal articles from The Economist and things like that. But the kind of personal perspective that she provided was really enjoyable and fun. So I really enjoyed that. Punjabi Parmesan, I have to explain the title before I move on to this book, was really based on Punjabi immigrants, farmers that had moved to Italy, and they were actually the ones producing this very Italian of cheeses. So really it was Parmesan made by Punjabis, and ergo the title. And it was really nice because that's the kind of ironical sense of humor Pallavi typically has in her books, which I really enjoy. So let's get on with this book. So what is this book about? It's about the time that she spent there, 4 years or so between 2016 and 2020. She moved there with her husband, who works for the UN, and her 2 kids. And so it's really about her experiences navigating the culture, making new friends, the kind of stuff that you do when you move countries. And along with that, of course, like I said, she's a fine journalist working for the top publications. So she's researching all these fantastic stories. So you get the best of both worlds. You get her experiences, she narrates them, but she puts down all the stories that she's done and the research that she's done and the understanding that is brought to her. And it all kind of makes its way into these pages. Now, Japan's occupied our mind space, cultural mind space, in a very big way across the world, no matter where you are. There are so many things that pervade global culture which come from Japan, whether it's their management policies and how they managed to beat the American car companies in the 80s and so on, or whether it's to do with how they've become really good at manufacturing whiskeys, whether it's their samurai sword philosophy, whether it's their history, their historical context, or it's about their dedication to work. And some things make it to the news in terms of how a lot of people die in Japan because of overwork, and that's also, by the way, in the book. So there's a lot about Japan. Actually, when I read this book, I realized how much of what we kind of talk about in our daily life and we kind of understand about the world comes from Japan, really. So this book is, every page has a new concept explaining something about Japan. It's so fantastic because you keep turning the pages and unrelentingly you will find out more and more about Japan. There will be concepts that you'll kind of remember or understand, like Japanese toilets. We've heard about how they're so fantastic and high tech and they have all these buttons and stuff like that. That will make it here. But there'll be other things that you don't know. For example, how they beautify their manhole covers and why that's a movement. And so this book is extremely like a condensation almost of Pallavi's time, 4 years that she's gathered all this information, and it's really thickly packed with concepts. And so every page when you turn, you get something, you learn something new about Japan. And there's everything here from Japanese philosophy, Japanese culture, Japanese history, some of the societal norms, anything you can think of, it's made it here. I think the 3 things she might have missed, and like a spoiler alert, giant robots kind of doesn't make it to this book. Giant lizards like Godzilla doesn't make it to this book. And there's, I think, a little bit of a mention of manga, but I love manga, so maybe I would have expected a little more, but it's not there. But apart from that, everything else about Japan I can think of is in there and more. The thing is, this book feels almost like you've been invited into Pallavi's home and you're kind of sitting there having dinner and drinks or something, and she's narrating all these anecdotes to you and telling you about Japan. If you're a curious listener, you kind of keep asking the questions, and she has an answer for everything, and she will come up with an anecdote, how cultures were, what she had to do in terms of adjustments in the new place, how she had to learn a new language, things like that. So it's really a warm book that way. It kind of feels very personal, and also it's intellectually kind of robust. So you get a lot of the historical context, you get a lot of the cultural context, you get all the background material, So you kind of don't just have to take somebody's word for it. There is proper journalistic investigation of all the issues that she talks about, all the concepts that she talks about, and it's really convincing when somebody talks to you like that in a book. So that's really what I felt about this book overall. But let me dig into some of the concepts that she talks about, because they're so entertaining and you'll get a feel for what kind of material this book is packed with. So initially she starts with moving to the country, and one of the first things she faces in Japan, which exposes her to the culture, is when she loses her wallet. And she realizes Japan is one of the safest places to lose your wallet. If you have to lose your wallet anywhere, lose it in Japan, because it'll probably be found. And she contrasts this with her experience in Europe, when essentially she's robbed as soon as she steps out of the airport in Belgium. And then the police is fairly lackadaisical about the loss, and they really can't do much, and they kind of are not really polite either. And in Japan, the experience is completely the opposite. So that's something that she starts out with. As she starts to become familiar with Japan, this is one of the first experiences. Also, she combines it with how school children who are very, very young typically travel alone by themselves, take public transport, go across town and attend school, and it's not a problem. And they're 9 years, 10 years old. And that's really something that talks about how safe Tokyo is as a city and overall Japan. Another thing she examines is kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of repairing ceramic bowls which break. So the Japanese believe that if something breaks, you kind of actually mend it by filling it in with gold and kind of embellishing it and treasuring it even more. So if something is broken, bent, it's actually treasured more because it's storied, it's lived a life, it has some experiences, and therefore it becomes a valued item. Unlike in many other parts of the world where something breaks and you kind of chuck it away, it's use and throw. Another concept she talks about is wabi-sabi, which is about elevating the simple into something very sublime and really working with simple rustic objects and valuing them. And that's the Japanese philosophy of wabi-sabi. So one of the things that was really interesting to me personally, because I've read a little bit of Japanese history, more of it modern history because of the wars, etc. But even, some of the older history is really about shogun and samurai and so on. And those are the kinds of typically the movies that you see which depict those eras. But what I didn't know, that Japan actually owes its cultural origins to Chinese civilization. And there has been an attempt to not be derivative of Chinese culture and kind of invent something that is originally truly Japanese in national origin. And that's something that Japan has sought. But it was interesting to see that the origins of Japanese culture lie in China. So the thing is that when you read a book like this, there are these intricacies about ordinary life that you get acquainted with that typically doesn't come across in some books that are historical or articles that are about the economy. And for example, she talks about how complicated garbage recycling is in Japan. So there are apparently tens of rules or hundreds of rules or whatever it is, and it's very difficult to master where a certain kind of garbage will go in terms of recycling. So in fact, a lot of people, she says, in Japan typically end up not recycling their garbage and just keeping their stuff inside their tiny homes, and everything keeps piling up because they don't want to take the trouble or they don't know how to recycle garbage. Very interesting point. These are the kinds of things you notice when you only move to a country. And that's really what I like about Pallavi's books, is that she kind of gives this ordinary bit of information that typically you wouldn't get anywhere else unless you spoke to a friend that had moved to a country and they mentioned it. So one of the first things she tackles is one of the biggest things in Japan. It's almost like their Christmas at some level, or their Diwali, so to speak, because Sakura, or cherry blossoms, the season when they bloom, apparently is like just an insane period in Japan. And the typical Japanese reserve is kind of put away and people celebrate and they drink sake, and it's really about observing nature, but it turns into these huge parties as well. And it was really interesting to read that description. So that's something that one knows about. Again, I know about this because I have Japanese friends, etc. There have been emails from Japanese colleagues in companies that I've worked in where they talk about this very rapturously. And so one has an inkling that, this festival is kind of important to them. But this description was really interesting about how the Japanese kind of behave during this festival, what it means to them. And of course, Pallavi doesn't always kind of eulogize a country, and that's what I really like. She kind of gets to the bottom of things. She doesn't believe in some of these nationalistic tropes that come up about, superior Japanese character and so on. She kind of gets to the scientific basis, the cultural, historical basis of it. And she talks about also the commercial exploitation of this, this cherry blossom festival in Japan, how that's a big part of things. It's like Diwali in India, it's like Christmas in India. It is an important festival, but of course, it becomes an opportunity for commerce to take advantage of that fact as well. So part of the Japanese identity that they were seeking led itself to nature and the appreciation of nature. So that's apparently a very heightened kind of facet of Japanese life. For example, dishes are only served in restaurants as per season, and it's kind of very in tune with its natural surroundings and the cycle of seasons and so on. In fact, Pallavi speaks about one app which earmarks 72 seasons in the year. So each season lasting about 5 days or so, and then the season changes and it's time for something else. And there's an actual app for that, for tracing which season you're in, micro season that you're in. Like I said, this book is very densely packed. Every page, once you turn, if you look at the notes I've made, there's like so many notes, and I probably am not going to be able to get through it because this will be a 1 hour talk. I won't call it a review. It's really a talk about the book, but I'm going to go through some of them because it's so interesting. She talks about the complexity of Japanese language. She's tried to speak the language wherever she goes. In China, I think she picked up a little bit of Mandarin. She does mention that she can speak a little bit of Indonesian, whatever that language is called. I'm pretty ignorant, so please forgive my ignorance. And so if you pick up a little bit of Mandarin, you pick up a little bit of the language they speak in Indonesia, you're assuming that you go to Japan, you learn a little bit of Japanese. But she admits her complete failure at being able to do this despite living there for 4 years, because the Japanese language apparently is very complex. And it has 3 scripts. This is really interesting. So one of them is kanji, or hanzi from Chinese, and called kanji in Japanese. So it uses the Chinese character, which is essentially pictorial. It's not an alphabet. And it has 2 alphabets. And one alphabet apparently has no use apart from repeating the first alphabet, the second script, and being used to spell out foreign names. It's called the katakana alphabet. And by the way, please forgive me if I'm pronouncing everything completely incorrectly, particularly if my Japanese friends are watching this. You have to forgive me, but I'm making the best attempt. And I'm not as good a researcher as Pallavi is. I'm not actually going into Google and typing all of this out because that's just going to take too much time. And I do this just for friends and family. So friends and family, please excuse me. And if you're not friends and family, excuse me anyway. Japan is fairly insular in terms of immigration, in terms of allowing foreigners into the fabric of its society. So she explores this through an Indian origin politician who's a Japanese citizen now, getting elected to one of the precincts in Tokyo. And obviously that becomes a big story. She goes and meets him, which was a very exceptional event in Japan, because typically there is a fair amount of reluctance to include foreigners as part of Japanese society. So very frequently you will find apparently bathhouses, or you'll find restaurants that only want to serve Japanese people and not foreigners. Gaijin, I think they call it, Gaijin. And again, forgive my pronunciation. And so that's something that's fairly problematic. And she talks about that issue. She talks about racism in Japan. She points out to people of Korean origin that are Japanese citizens who face discriminatory practices, etc. Criminal gangs like the Yakuza are made up of a large percentage of such minorities. So that's really a problematic issue. It sounds familiar from all the things that you hear about racism across the world. In fact, she talks about almost like a Dalit segment of Japanese society called the Burakumin. Now, again, excuse my pronunciation. And typically it's a very similar story because they were engaged in labor which is considered unclean. They're kind of almost treated as outcasts. It's not quite as bad as India in terms of the caste system, what used to be, but historically, but it is a problematic issue because there's a huge amount of discrimination, prejudice against these minorities. So while we talk of Japan, we hear about the whiskeys and we hear about the samurai swords and we hear about all of that, but these are things that I've never known about Japan, and I'm particularly interested in the country, in the culture of the country, and I have friends who live there and friends who spent time there and come back to India. So it's really interesting to see and kind of learn about these things. And this book, like I said, does it so beautifully because it's not overwhelming. It's guiding you along like a friend. It's talking to you like it's a dinner time conversation with an intellectual person who knows what they're talking about, but it's a conversation with a friend. Here's one very important aspect of Japanese life. Their almost religious affinity for cleanliness. Apparently it begins early in life, and a lot of children in school clean up their own school. In lots of schools, they actually clean up the toilets as well. So there are no janitors in the school, but some schools will have them just clean the entire school, the floors, etc. There's a cleaning time, and they all have rags under their tables, which they use to clean, and then they kind of clean them and put them back again. So it's kind of an aspect that's learned very early in life, and it kind of becomes an important part of the Zen philosophy also, and all of Japanese culture. And that's why you'll have heard that, I'm sure you've heard of this example where Japanese fans go into a football stadium, and then before they leave, even if they lose, they kind of carry out all the garbage and clean it up behind them. There's not a spot left. And this is again one of the diametrically opposite behaviors compared to what you typically see in India. Believe me, I'm skipping over a whole bunch of stuff here. So one of the things I really like is the Indian perspective. And Pallavi writes really well. Her language use is fantastic. She's not pretentious, but she's sophisticated enough that you enjoy the language. Occasionally you have to look up a couple of words. But it's nice because you improve your vocabulary. It's easy reading despite all of that. It's very nicely written. It's a good turn of phrase. There's irony, there's humor, there's a lot of information, but it's also good storytelling. This representation, very, very important. I hope you continue to write books. You write many more books on different cultures. In fact, your writing is so entertaining and you know so much about different cultures that you could easily write like a global crime series or something. You should write a detective novel set in Japan. Please think that up, write some great stories set in Japan, set in this kind of cultural milieu that you've described over here. I'm definitely signing up to read that book. So towards the end of the book, Pallavi speaks about how she had to leave under the shadow of the coronavirus and basically couldn't complete her bucket list of things to do in Japan, and how she's sad about leaving. She ties the entire book together through haiku at various points, which is an interesting device, obviously, because she uses those powerful lines to kind of press home the emotional meaning of things that she talks about. So she does that in an interesting way, and when she leaves, her last passage is really, her last words are really a haiku. This book is beautifully written. I recommend it completely. I give it 5 out of 5 stars. So entertaining, so informative, and essentially an Indian perspective upon Japan and the rest of the world. So more power to you, Pallavi. Please keep doing this. More books, hopefully, and like I said, perhaps a fiction book. Orienting, an Indian in Japan. Get your copy today. And I'll see if I can get Pallavi online and maybe we can do an interview, and I'll talk to her a little bit about this book coming together and put it up in the channel so friends and family can enjoy it. Thanks for watching. Please leave your comments in the comments box below. Leave your suggestions. Tell me about other books that you'd want me to review. And please come back again soon. Thanks for watching.